Good morning. It is great to be together as we really start today kind of looking at some of the most troubling things that Jesus said. How's that for a new year? We're starting a series and it's called You've Heard It Said. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Sermon on the Mount. Anybody heard of the Sermon on the Mount? You've heard of it? I read as I was kind of studying for this, a commentary of a religious scholar quipped. He said the Sermon on the Mount is the thing that Christians have spent most of Christian history trying to figure out how to get out from underneath, because it's it's some of the most powerful teaching of Jesus, some of the most familiar statements of Jesus, but also some of the most difficult for us to understand, but even more so difficult for us to apply, to figure out if we do these things, how in the world is this going to work out? And this really leads us to what we think about when it comes to our lives and the way our lives are supposed to work. And the question I want to begin with by asking you is, can y'all see that? Not very good. Purple is out. What do you trust? Really? Like, what is it that you trust? What is the foundation that you depend upon, rest upon for your security, for your, hey, this is how I can plan or predict or move forward? What is the thing that's underneath it all? And this is really important because what Jesus is going to be addressing here is a lot different than what we think that it is. And so if you have your Bibles, we're going to look in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. Not all today, but over the next few weeks. But I would recommend that you sit down and read this from start to finish. It takes about 11 minutes, I think is what I timed myself doing it in. I'm a pretty slow reader. It's 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7. And there's actually a book that I read years ago called The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard. It is about, it's got to be 500 pages. It took me 2.5 years to read. It is on the Sermon on the Mount. It is spectacular. It is difficult. It is all of those things. So I'm going to take and try to sum that up in a few weeks and just inflict that on all of us together. But this is arguably the largest collection of Jesus' teachings in the Bibles. It's if your Bible has red letters, it's just 3 chapters of red letters. And it's a collection. More than likely, this was delivered multiple times. I hear it's delivered to a particular group of people. It's recorded again in Luke, and it's slightly different. But this collection has a lot of his famous sayings. Again, the golden rule is in here. You know the golden rule, right? Do unto others, you'd have them do unto you. The Lord's Prayer is smack in the middle of this Sermon on the Mount. You've probably heard the statement, even if you're not really a believer, you've heard something about turning the other cheek. You've probably heard that. That's in here. You've heard about the second mile. There are whole corporations that built their brands on going the second mile. Well, this is one of the teachings of Jesus found in the Sermon on the Mount. And it also contains in here these famous "you have heard it said" statements, which is where Jesus says, you've heard it said, thou shalt not kill. But I say to you, if you even get angry with someone, right? You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you hold lust in your heart, you've heard it said, thou shalt, and he goes on and he basically says, here's the commands you've heard and here's what I say to you. And what I think this does, this sets a huge tension for all of us by challenging what it is that we have heard and what we have long thought. And then he adds something else instead. And this gives us a tension for us today to challenge, what is it you have long thought? Right? I talk to people, especially who've walked with the Lord, been in churches, you have heard it said something, but Jesus is perhaps saying something different. And what this is going to come down to is our willingness to trust him. Our willingness to trust what he says and then define and discover ways to let this be fleshed out in our lives as a kind of people. What you'll find in this message, in this Sermon on the Mount, not this message here, hopefully you'll get it there, but in Sermon on the Mount, is that Jesus is driving us to understand something about ourselves and the kind of people that we actually are. And this is absolutely essential for us, for anybody really, but particularly for those of us who are pursuing some things in the world that are redemptive and that are hopeful. It's to consider the kind of people that we actually are and not just what we say and what we do or even what we think. I talk to people, a lot of people all the time who say they believe certain things, but what they do and how they act is just very, very at odds with those things. And all of us have places like this in our lives where we have heard it said, but Jesus says to us, we're like, well, I'm not really sure that's going to work out too well. So this is part of what it is. So I want to begin, really what this is, when it comes to us, is these words are going to be deeply challenging, I think, to what you have heard and to what you already think. And they're going to challenge what you depend upon to control and to predict and to hold and to make. They're going to challenge those things. But the invitation is for us to trust that somehow what he says will do something in us and for us. And so I want to begin this topic or this series with the end of the sermon from Jesus. And this is in Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 24. And Jesus has gone through this whole thing. He begins it with, you've probably heard the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they'll be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they'll inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And a lot of us think that we hear like, blessed are you who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And we think it's like a locker room talk. Are you hungry enough to give your... He's talking to people who are oppressed and marginalized and poor. These are people who know what it is to hunger. Hunger isn't about like the will to win. Hunger is, do I have enough to survive? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they'll receive mercy. Blessed are those who are pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for my name's sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is how it begins. And here's how, then it goes through all this list of things: murder, adultery, salt and light, and love your enemies, all the things. Then Matthew chapter 7, verse 24, here's how he closes this out. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rains came down and the storms rose and the wind blew and beat against the house, and yet it did not fall. And it did not fall, why? Because it had its foundation on the rock. So what you immediately see here is the person who hears his words and puts them into practice. Notice what he doesn't say. Those who hears these words and just executes on them. Those who hear these words and puts them into practice. This isn't something you can just execute on. It's something you have to enter into. Those who hear these words and put them into practice, you will have a foundation, right, that isn't threatened by the storms coming. Verse 26, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the storms rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. And when Jesus had finished saying all these things, the crowds were amazed. Their minds were blown at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, not like the other teachers of the law. There was something different about him. So here's what I want to ask you. If we hear all these things in these next 3 weeks, what's the promise that Jesus gives us if we hear these words and we put them into practice? What's the promise? The promise is that you will have a foundation that can withstand the storms and the weight of our lives. That's the promise. There's a sufficient foundation that can support your life in the midst of this chaotic world. A lot of us think and assume that if we just come to faith or have enough faith, our lives will be storm-free. And that's not the case. One of the things that's happened in our culture, in our world, especially as this sort of just crept back into all of us, is that we recognize more and more readily and more frequently that the world is broken, and our hope that it will be different soon is sort of waning. Would you sense that? So what most of us resolve to do is just to pull in and take care of our own sort of tribe or our own little world. And what we've got to learn how to do is to recognize that the world is broken and it's not likely to get better, but that's not where our hope is. The foundation that we need is one that can withstand the chaos of the world. And he says if we learn how to hear his words and put them into practice, this is where the foundation, the promise in this is stability. I want to take a few moments and say a few words about this, because when I sat down years ago, I was trying to figure out, what does spiritual maturity look like? I was like in my 20s. Because I heard people talk about spiritual maturity, being mature in your faith. What I always thought it was people who could quote from Obadiah, right? I was in my quiet time in Leviticus the other day, you're like, woo, right? And you immediately think, because it's somehow we can use these things that people, that make us seem smart or seem enlightened or seem, wise or deep or whatever it is. In fact, there's I don't have time to get into that, but people pursue trivia and they mistake it for a depth of faith. And people do this all the time. Like there's a depth to what is happening in you. And it happens not because you know more about the Bible. It happens because you understand and see God's work in your life and in the world around you. And that, of course, gets revealed through the scriptures. But it's more than that. And so there's this idea, when I sat down and looked at this, what is it? And there was 3 words right down, and we've kind of developed this, but stability, gratitude, and generosity. These 3 things mark maturity. If you want to know if you're maturing, you just look at these 3 things. Are you more stable? Are you more likely to fly off the handle, lose your mind every time something doesn't work out, every time the election doesn't go like you think it should go, or every time this doesn't happen, do you lose your mind? It's not a function of God's right, it's a function of maturity. Can you handle the wind and the rain? You have a foundation that can handle it. Gratitude. Gratitude is just the sense that we are receivers, right? That the more we learn in everything, give thanks, for this is the will of God. That's in our Bibles. And then generosity is this idea that we no longer are afraid or so afraid that we have to hold on, but rather we are free to give. And so stability is sort of the first marker. I remember, because this is important for all of us, because it's interesting. You remember, like, have you ever seen a toddler throw a fit? It's amazing. They fold themselves in half, put their head on the floor, and just lose their mind, right? And it can be like, because you're just not getting their bottle fast enough, or you're not getting dinner fast enough. And it's like it's like, hold up, right? This is gonna take 3 minutes. And you're trying to reason with them, and there's just no reasoning with them. Why? Because they're toddlers, they're immature. If you're 17 or 18, you still fold in half, put your head on the floor, and lose your mind, right? There's a problem. It's a disproportionate response. At some point, we learn that everything doesn't warrant losing our minds over. There's a stability to us. That comes from maturity. I know in our culture, like we do not value this at all. Everything is sold to us. You can't tell if it's nuclear war or if there's a sale on cars, right? It's all like, you gotta come get this now. And like everybody's losing their minds over everything. There's a way for us. There's a way for us to live that doesn't require us. That's a foundation for us. Stability. So we have to find stability for us. And here's the thing. Every human being, it doesn't matter what you believe, but every human being, you need a foundation that can support the weight of your hope and your desire and your longings and your emotions. And whatever that is has to be able to hold all those things. And this is exactly what Jesus offers to us. He says to us, if you hear these things and you put them into practice, you're gonna find a foundation that will support the weight of the life that you long to live. That's the promise in this. And we have to define stability as like this. Stability is finding peace and security in all circumstances because I trust Christ. That's a really important phrase and idea here. Hearing his words isn't just doing what he said, but rather what he is actually saying is he's inviting us to trust him, and something has to happen in us. You have heard it said, right? Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. Right? This is the cry of almost all of us when we don't know how things are going to be, or we don't know how to do our jobs. Some of you, this is how you lead your employees. You just tell them what to do and they execute on your commands. So if you parent like this, you just tell them what to do and they execute on your commands. At some point, though, they're going to have to become a kind of person for whom these things actually emerge out of them, and they don't just take commands from you. As an organization here, this is one of our values at Port City Community Church is the value of discovery. It's because there are things about who we are, about what God is doing, that if I just told you, hey, do this, you're going to think you're doing what you're never going to discover and understand. This is exactly Jesus' point when he says, you've heard it said, do not commit murder. So you think you're doing good because you didn't kill the person. You're like, didn't kill him. Like that's some high bar of human investment. He's like, no, if you have contempt for them, if you say raka, right? That's the Hebrew word comes from the word, it's the noise of spitting, like you're so disgusted with someone that you just, if you do that, you've done far worse because you're not becoming the kind of person. He's dealing with something inside of us. Right? We've got to, so this has to involve us. He can't just say, don't kill. Okay, I didn't kill. You've all had this with your kids, and there's tons of ways this happens, right? Where we give rules and commands, and they obey the rules and the commands, and they miss the point. And human beings are geniuses at this. It's why there's 613 commands in the law. And some of them say something like this. And this is in the Bible. Do not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. What was happening that you had to tell someone to do that? I'm like, are you 7th grade? Like, what are we doing here? Right? When Jesus is saying that there's a way for us, there's something that has to happen in us. And some of us have gotten really good at executing biblical strategies for morality, and we've completely missed the point. We've completely missed the point of what it means to be the kind of people that God has called us to be. We've missed the point to learn how to live as those who belong to Him, those who bear His image with integrity, and who carry the influence of His love, and we carry this influence well. The message seems to be in the Sermon on the Mount is in order to live like this, you have to be like this. This is why we do My One Word. This is why I believe so deeply in it, because the point isn't just to try to be the kind of person that's better than you were, or to stop doing this or to start doing that. The point is, when you think about like, I don't want to be angry, or I don't want to be this, or I don't want to be that, instead of thinking about not wanting to be those things, you have to think about what kind of person would you have to become so that those things are unthinkable. That's what Jesus is inviting us into, a kind of being that makes these things come out of us quite naturally, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile, to not execute revenge. These are all things that you're going to see in here that are very difficult to apply in our current world. But this is exactly what Jesus came to do. So here's what he says, and this has bothered me for a long time. I'm going to try to tackle it incompletely, but I think it gives us a nod in where we want to go. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus says, here's what I'm doing. He goes through, you're the salt, you're the light of the earth, a city on a hill cannot be hidden, and he's not talking about a nation, he's talking about his people. And he says this, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And so in my mind, I have to write this down. I have to go, okay, so Jesus came to do something. He said, I have fulfilled, there we go. I have fulfilled something, or the better way is he has filled it full. He's fulfilled something. And then he says, I've not come to abolish the law of the prophets, but I've come to fulfill them. And then he says this in verse 18. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is, what's the word? Finished or accomplished. And you begin to see this, at least I began to see this tension. Because I've always wondered this, like when Jesus fulfilled the law, does it mean you can get tattoos now? Because it still says you're not supposed to have tattoos. And listen, I'm fine with tattoos, and I can give you a whole reason why. You wear mixed fabrics. There's a lot of things in here that we've tried to concoct and figure out how to get around, but this is where we got to get really honest about these things. Jesus would go on and say this in verse 19. I'm just going to read this and then we'll get to it. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do accordingly will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. That is not something I take lightly. If I tell you to do something or instruct you in a way that causes you to do something that minimizes or dismisses something, that's a serious offense. So I'm not trying to play games with this. I want us to really pursue the way of Jesus in this. Whoever practices in teaching these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter into the kingdom of heaven. And we don't have time to get into all that, but I want to focus on what Jesus said. I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And nothing is going to pass. It's going to remain until everything is accomplished. And so what is that? What is lacking that needs to be filled? That's the question. If Jesus came to, so what is lacking? You get clues in there, right? He says, I've had this happen, right? You tell your kids, be home by 11 or 11:30 or midnight, or depends on how nice of a parent you are, what curfew is. And your kids come home, and what you hope is they come home and say, Mom and Dad, I'm home safely. I love you. I appreciate so much your care and concern for me that it is my delight to obey your command for a curfew. But that's not what happens. They come and go, I'm home. Boom. What is lacking? Right? Do you see what is lacking? What is lacking in this, I did it? What's lacking is something in here that makes us the kind of people for whom these things are normal. To love your enemies, to go the extra mile, to turn the other cheek, to forbid yourself to see people as objects of pleasure or contempt. And it's not just to stop doing them, it's to be the kind of people for whom these things are unthinkable. That's what Jesus is driving at. And I think what is lacking is the effect. So what he fulfilled was he made a way for something to happen that now needs to be accomplished somewhere. And that somewhere is in us. This is not a better obedience to the Torah. This isn't just about you trying harder not to do the things you shouldn't do or trying harder to do the things that you think you should do. It is a different obedience to follow Jesus, to trust him. Remember last week, Disney, to learn how to navigate life with someone who knows how to form us and to get us along in the world. We are always operating from trust. Everything that you build your life upon, you're building it upon something that you trust, whether it is in your capacity to generate income, your capacity to influence or lead, or you're always operating from trust. This is where our sense of stability always comes from. We trust some philosophy or some system or some way of arranging our lives in order to find what we are looking for, or to satisfy some desire. Whether we call that happiness, or we call it relief, or we call it escape, or some other thing, it's always the essence. And what you depend upon for your security will be what you think will make you feel okay or be okay, and its foundation is trust. What is it that you trust? That's what we have to get to. The execution of strategies, even religious strategies, are not sufficient. We have been made to live in a reconciled relationship with God, and this is precisely what Jesus came to fulfill. That's the point. Hebrews chapter 7, this is written for us later on, and the writer of Hebrews says it this way, verse 18 and 19 of chapter 7, the former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless. It could not make us perfect. You could not kill somebody, but still have wanted to kill them. Right? That's the point. But a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. So here's what I want to say. I want to tell you, I want to kind of bring us to a close. His fulfillment, what Jesus came to do, makes this reconciliation available to us. It makes it available. The possibility for you to live as one who is reconciled to God is now available. It has been fulfilled. But now it only gets accomplished. It gets accomplished in us. It is our faith, right, that brings this to a sense of accomplishments. Our faith, when you trust him enough to take a step and act, put into practice what he has said, this is where the accomplishment happens. And the sort of bonus is you find a foundation that can support the weight of the life that you want. But this is an extraordinary thing for us to consider. His fulfillment, like this fulfillment of what God intends to do and has done in Jesus, is accomplished as we learn not only to live out this kind of faith, but to live as his people. And that's where a lot of us get tripped up because we don't mind executing a strategy. We don't want anyone claiming allegiance over us or authority over us. I'll do what you say, but I'm going to do it my way. And he's like, no. It's the identity piece that he's really forming and forging. He's forming us into a people. This has always been what the commands are always about, that God would have a people with whom he would dwell. He would be their God. We would be his people. We would live together in a reconciled relationship. That's the point. And this gets accomplished as you trust him enough to take a step. So it says in here, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I say to you, if you've already looked at a woman lustfully in your heart, you've already committed adultery with her. And you go, how can that be? And so you learn to trust, it takes a step that you begin to protect your eyes and watch and pay attention. This goes both ways, by the way. This isn't just directed toward men. This is all the things that we do when we trust him enough to bring ourselves under submission and allegiance to him. We begin to find something, experience something, to live as one who belongs to him. Tomorrow, many of you probably know, is Martin Luther King Day. It was commemorated, celebrated his birthday as the third Monday in January. Tomorrow is the 15th, which is actually his birthday. And part of my own exercise over the last decade or so is rather than just to read quotes or post quotes about Martin Luther King, I've just taken time and read his speeches. And I would highly recommend that you do that. Letters from a Birmingham jail. My favorite one is the one he wrote right before he was assassinated, the speech he gave right before he was assassinated. He's been to the mountaintop. And he sees something. And he says, longevity is to be desired, but it may no longer be available to me. He said that a day before he was assassinated. Longevity is a good thing, but longevity of life is a good thing, but it may not be available for me. And you sort of enter into the tension. And you feel what he felt when you read his speeches. And there's places you can actually listen to them and watch them. It's powerful to do that. And so I've made it a practice over the years to read minority authors, to understand. And this past year, actually November, December, I found a book by Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman was a civil rights activist. He was a pastor. He was an author. He was born in 1899, lived until 1981. But his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, was rumored to have been in Martin Luther King's coat pocket on many occasions. It was one of the most influential writings that inspired Martin Luther King. When you read the book, you can just begin to really see how it influenced and affected Martin Luther King in profound ways. And what I love is the subtitle of the book. It's called Jesus and the Disinherited, Jesus' Message to the Insecure and Oppressed Men of Today, written in 1949. Jesus' message to the insecure and the oppressed. Now, it is one more comment. When you read it, you'll see some things that are profound when someone is writing from a very oppressed place and has very little hope in a system. And it probably puts you more in line with what was happening in the Sermon on the Mount than anything else. Jesus was speaking to people who knew oppression and marginalization and being left out and having very little hope that anything would be different. And it's good for us to enter into those places and have conversations. And so one of the things that struck me is the call and the vision for dignity and worth and identity, for a belonging in Howard Thurman's book. And he outlines these three, he calls them hounds of hell, fear, deception, and hate that always undermine God's vision of rule. And it's if you get a chance to read it, it's brilliant. But it wars against cynicism and futility and this sort of idea that things will never be different, which I think, right, certainly as an African-American in that age, it was everywhere. You couldn't get away from it. In our culture today, we sort of been able to build these ways to avoid those things, but cynicism and futility still sort of runs underneath because we're like, why should we give ourselves if it's not going to make any difference anyway? And this is where it depends on the kind of person we become. Here's what Howard Thurman says. I want to read this and kind of unpack it, and then I'll be done. In the absence of all hope, ambition dies. And the very self, the very identity is weakened and corroded. When we lose hope, when we lose the vision that things could be different or better, there's a disintegration. It's degenerative in our lives. There remains only the elemental will to live and to accept life on the terms that are available. This is just the way things are going to be. And something happens to us that's devastating. Right? Cynicism and futility doesn't define you. It actually undermines you. It robs you. It keeps you from being or becoming the kind of person you've been intended to become. And he goes on, he continues this, and this is what he says: there is a profound measure of resourcefulness in all life. This is written again in 1940s. Resourcefulness in all life, a resourcefulness that is guaranteed by the underlying aliveness of life itself. That somehow in every human being, in every person, there is something there that is longing to be seen and called out. And this is exactly what Jesus is doing. He says, you have been created to belong. The question that Howard Thurman is answering is, is there any help in this circumstance that the way of Jesus provides? And his answer is yes. And he says this because our belonging to God and our depth of character, or the depth of character that comes from one who belongs to God, that's what provides our sense of security and stability that supersedes the chaos of the way we experience the world. That who you become, who you are, has the capacity to supersede the chaos, the circumstances of the world. This is exactly what Jesus said when it says, whoever hears my words and puts them into practice builds their life on a rock that is not shaken or undermined by the chaos of this world. We are ushered in to a new way to live out our faith, of course, but to live as those who belong to God. We are ushered into a new way of navigating the world, a way that is free from cynicism and fear and withholding and calculating and protecting, free from despair. I tried to watch the news this week. I tried hard to see what was going on. It's like, oh my gosh, we are being sold despair and fear. How do we navigate the world? Right? How do we learn how to do this? This is what Jesus is inviting us into, to become the kind of people for whom these things are true. We're going to talk about the what in the next couple of weeks. But I want for you to imagine that you can navigate this world faithfully and full of hope. That no matter what is happening around us, what's going on around us, we have a foundation that can support the weight of this. Here's what I want you to understand. So much of our culture is how. It is not so much how we navigate the world, but rather the kind of people that we are as we navigate the world. Did you hear that? It's not how you get around. It's who you are as you do. Again, this is why we use my one word, because it's your to-be list versus your to-do list. It's all those things. I think that our identity, who we believe ourselves to be, and I don't mean that in like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can do it. I mean like who Jesus has made us to be, what he's fulfilled in us. That this identity contributes more to how we will navigate the world, far more than our skill at navigating it does. So here's what I want to ask you for your homework today. What do you depend on for your stability? And don't just go, Jesus. Because we all depend on finances. We all depend on other people. We all depend. There's a lot of factors in this. I'm not asking you to deny those things. I'm asking you to say, Lord, remember our postures. Lord, can you help us see something in a way that changes the way we see everything else? There's nothing wrong with those things. There's nothing wrong with finding comfort in those things. But I want us to be honest about where we're driving and deriving these things from. And the second question is, what is the condition of the foundation that you trust? What's the condition of it? Can it support the weight of what you feel? Right? You have heard it said, but Jesus comes along and he says, trust me and follow me and become. That you might live out this way of life really, but more important, that you will learn to live as those who belong, those who have been redeemed, and those who are being renewed. That's what we're after. And this happens as we learn, as it's accomplished, as we trust him enough to take a step. Whoever hears my words and puts them into practice, you will have a foundation that can support the weight of your life. That's the promise. We're going to learn how to do that next couple weeks. Sound good? Father, thank you. That's a great promise that we want. And so I ask that you would really awaken that in us to want that, because what's required in that is very challenging. So I ask you to help us process, to do that with one another. Help us to process with you. And Lord, that more than anything, that we would become kind of people who bear your image with integrity and who carry well the influence of your love. Would you form us into that kind of people? And in doing so, we find that we rest on a rock. And I ask all this in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King. Amen.